Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Colin Liddell. Hello, Colin, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Lipton, how are you doing?
I'm great. So, Colin, you disavow the alt-right. Why?
Well, um, yes and no, because the alt-right, it means different things at different times.
Yes.
And I was part of the alt-right, and in some cases, I'm often seen as one of the founders of the alt-right. And and this is something that is problematic for me in various ways. And the reason for this is because the alt right has a history, and it's been through several changes. And now most people would say the alt right is finished, and
Dead.
it's a post movement, and but still the term keeps bubbling up. So and so the way I see the alt right, I see 2010 the alt right emerges with the site alternativeright.com, which was founded and started by Richard Spencer. Um, it's a legitimate intellectual movement at that point. There's a lot of narratives. There's a lot of ideas that have been pushed down over the years, and the alt right is a kind of reassertion of all those ideas and ideology from a history of suppression that goes back several decades, and it's a legitimate expression of those ideas. After a few years, the alt right starts to mutate into something else. It becomes much more tied up with this mimetic culture. And also, it starts to pick up a lot of ideas from the past that were, in a way, correctly suppressed. And those ideas are, of course, the kind of neo-Nazi, Jew-obsessed ideas. There's always been a kind of undercurrent of Nazi, Jew-obsessed nationalism in Western countries, and that element starts to take over the alt-right and to dominate it and to poison its message. And at first, it has a certain the shock value of that element. It seems to have its own function. It's been used in a way to ironically shock and publicize certain ideas, but then the method of publicizing these ideas then becomes the dominant form of the alt right. And the alt right, instead of just like using ironic Nazi memes to gain attention, instead of that, it starts to become purely, the Nazi memes. And so this is kind of what happened with TRS, because TRS, the Right Stuff, the Daily Show podcast, it has its own history. People who know about TRS know that it came from a kind of libertarian perspective, and then it gradually moved towards a kind of neo-Nazi perspective. So, that's this is why the term alt-right is very problematic. So the early alt-right was a legitimate reassertion of suppressed ideas, but then around about 2015, 2016, you start to see the alt-right being kind of taken over by this Naziist element, the Right Stuff, and other organs like the Daily Show, etc. Sorry, the Daily Stormer.
Yes. All right. So, Colin, why is the alt-right obsessed with critiquing Jews? I don't have a problem with analyzing power structures, but the obsession with Jews, it appears to be quite unhealthy.
There is a kind of again, there's all these layers. I mean, there is a legitimate way to critique Jews, like Jewish power, Zionism, etc. Right now, we're seeing this situation in the Middle East, where um, people in Gaza are firing rockets at Israel, and Israel is bombing Gaza. And all of this kind of grows out of the problems that the creation of Israel has caused in the Middle East. You know, whether you're a supporter of Israel or the Palestinians or the Arab world, there's a fundamental problem there, and you could address it in terms of being anti-Zionist and so forth. Also, in American politics, it's very evident that Jews have a disproportionate amount of influence, and that one of the reasons that America is so supportive of Israel is because of this Zionist element, which is also backed up by the evangelical element in America. So there's a legitimate basis for critiquing Jewish power, but what we see on the alt-right or elements of the dissident right is this kind of obsession with Jews as kind of quintessentially evil and something that is not really part of Western civilization. You know, so the more respectable elements of the alt-right, you'd probably say that would be countercurrents.
Yes.
They try to present themselves in a kind of more serious intellectual way, but essentially they follow that same kind of National Socialist Hitlerist view of the Jews as the kind of awkward piece in the jigsaw puzzle, something that doesn't quite fit into Western culture and something which has to be kind of pushed out to Western culture. So even the more serious elements of the alt-right are kind of tied to that Nazi viewpoint, and it's essentially based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the real situation. You could also say that even somebody like Jared Taylor is partly tied to that, even though Jared Taylor famously said things like, they look pretty white to me, and often has Jews at his Amren conferences. Jared Taylor also goes to the Scanza Forum, and the Scanza Forum kind of ties him to a lot of neo-Naziist elements. So this is something that people in the dissident right, especially in America, seem to be extremely naive about. How their ideas get associated with this very, very negative tendency, and a tendency which actually makes it very, very easy for people to attack their more sensible ideas. I mean, there's, you know, a site like Countercurrents, it has a lot of sensible ideas and good content.
And Occidental Observer, I like the Occidental Quarterly.
Of course, yeah, the Occidental Observer. These are all sites that, and of course, Amren itself. These are all sites that have good content, they have good writers, and have good ideas. But they're also associated with this kind of Naziist view of the Jews as inherently evil and as something that can't be fully assimilated into the West. And I think this is something that's pertinent to your ideas, because you believe in a kind of more all-embracing Western view of things.
Yes, I'm pro-Western civilization.
Yeah, and that means you want Western civilization not just for Westerners, but for people who are not Western, like, you know, people who are not from Europe, or, for example. And if the Jews can't be kind of assimilated into Western civilization, which is what this element of the alt-right believes, then there's not much hope for anybody else, is there?
Well, I read Amrem. To be honest, I contribute to Amrem. I wrote for Occidental Observer, and I have a piece in Countercurrent. I actually interviewed Gregory Johnson. So in a sense, I'm familiar with all these characters, but I must say that Amrem is not passionate about engaging the Jewish issue in comparison to other groups on the far right, or what some would term the dissident right.
Yeah, I mean, it's often seen as a third rail, and for good reasons. And I've made the case in an article or two that the alt-right has basically spiked its own guns with regards to the JQ. Like I said earlier, there is a legitimate basis to, you know, critique Zionism and Jewish power and Jewish influence in American politics, etc. But the alt-right has actually destroyed its ability to do that, because whatever they say, even if they make valid criticisms of Jewish power, nobody's going to take them seriously because of all the Nazi memes.
Exactly. And the truth is that Jews take their religion seriously, and even Jews who are not religious still identify as Jewish in a cultural sense. And many serious writers have noted that Jews are essentially strangers in Western society. So I don't have a problem with engaging Judaism or critiques of Jewish power structures, but I do agree with you. Sometimes it becomes inane.
Yeah. I mean, we're sort of branching into bigger topics like what do Jews, what is the Jewish attitude to Western civilization? Do they feel any more kind of alienated than anybody else by that civilization? I mean, lots of European groups have difficulty fully fitting into this kind of collective Western civilization, because collective Western civilization has certain dominant threads. And so you have in Europe, you have various fringe groups, so that's just the nature of collective identities.
Yes. But Colin, prior to the start of our conversation, we were talking about the alt-right, and you were going to tell us the nature of the movement and why some people are attracted to it. So we can continue with that conversation for our audience.
Yes.
Yeah.
My theory of the alt right. Well, I believe there was at least two alt rights, and there was a kind of transition around about 2015 to 2016, and then you had two very distinctly different alt rights. And so the alt right is just, it's pretty well known that the alt right kind of emerged around 2010 with the site alternativeright.com, which was started by Richard Spencer, who had previously been editor of Tacky Mag for a time, and who had worked for a conservative publication before that. And Richard Spencer created Alternative Right because there were a lot of alt-right or various kind of right-wing perspectives were bubbling up at the time. And this would be during the Obama presidency. I think it would be the first Obama presidency. And at the time, alt-right was an expression of a lot of ideas that had been squeezed out of the American conservative movement over the last several decades. Certain things like human biodiversity, gender differences, things like that, that the American conservative movement found very problematic to deal with, because dealing with those ideas in the 1970s and 1980s and so on, that started to have a much higher political cost. And so a lot of those ideas were therefore squeezed out of mainstream conservative politics. And the alt-right was a kind of reassertion of those ideas. So those ideas are all based upon fundamental facts and differences between different groups of people and different sexes, etc. And that was a very legitimate reassertion of those ideas. And so the alt-right was originally a intellectually serious movement, and it was performing a very necessary function. But there were also certain ideas that had also been suppressed over the years for very good reasons, and I'm referring here mainly to these kind of neo-Nazi, Jew-obsessed ideas. And those ideas then started to percolate up into the alt-right, and often I suspect that there may have been a kind of underhand motivation for that. There might have been certain groups who were trying to sabotage the alt-right by associating it with those ideas. This is something I have a lot of knowledge and data about, and so I would say that the alt-right was actually partially sabotaged by outside actors who came in and infiltrated it and started to push up these narratives. And so what we saw around about 2015, 2016, we started to see the alt-right move much more in a kind of mimetic direction, much more towards this kind of originally ironic form of neo-Nazism. And at the time, it could all be, explained and passed off as a kind of internet shock tactic to gain attention. And so people were supposed to believe that, they're just using Nazi memes to, wage mimetic warfare. They don't really believe in all that rubbish. But what happened? The people who were most involved in that started to become controlled by it and dominated by it, and so you saw a much more sincere form of Nazism starting to emerge through the alt-right, and a lot of the people in the alt-right started to become out and out National Socialists in a kind of 1930s sense of the word.
Yes.
So those are the two alt-rights I'm talking about. An earlier legitimate alt-right, intellectually serious alt-right, which was a reassertion of suppressed intellectual tradition, and a later alt-right, which is just Nazi memes, TRS, the Daily Stormer, Andrew Anglin. And a lot of those people were very suspicious, very suspect. Mike Enoch, it's well known that he is Jewish. Weave, a key player in the Daily Stormer, he's well known as being Jewish. And so you can't really take these people seriously because on the one hand, they're pushing this Naziist view of the world.
Hold on,
and
Colin, before you continue. So I read your work and you are allowed to say it in the public. I do believe that you think that some people are functionaries of the deep state, and you can say that.
Yes, I would say that somebody like Andrew Anglin, somebody like Mike Enoch, I wouldn't say they're absolutely functionaries of the deep state, but I'd say there's a high possibility that they're functionaries of the deep state. Only the deep state could confirm whether they were their functionaries or not. But also there's not, in addition to functionaries of the deep state, there's also a lot of useful idiots who found the aesthetic and even the ideology of Nazism appealing. And, I think there's two main groups of people who are emotionally drawn to the Naziist alt-right. And for me, I've kind of explained this by the terms sub-white and sub-masculine. And this is just something that I empirically evolved, just through observation. And I noticed that there was a disproportionate number of gay people, or closet gay people, or people who gave off a kind of gay vibe in the alt-right. And there was also a disproportionate number of people who had some sort of racial identity problem. So, for example, I've already mentioned certain Jewish people, and there's certain types of like, for example, if you look at TRS, who are the main players in TRS?
Well, the right stuff?
Yes.
You can continue. I haven't read it in a while.
Yeah. But there's Mike Enoch.
Okay, Mike Enoch. I'm familiar with Mike Enoch.
Yeah, so Mike Painovich and Jesse.
Mike Cernovich?
Mike Cernovich is somebody else.
Okay. You said repeat that name again. Mike who?
Painovich.
Okay.
Yeah, these Vich names, yes. Cernovich and Painovich, maybe they're related. But anyway, Mike Cernovich, he's much more of a so-called alt-lighter and, normie conservative in some respects. But, the people at TRS, Ghoul, Seventh Son, Mike Enoch, Stryker, these kind of people, they're all got a certain sub-white element. Either they have a kind of Jewish background, or they don't look as white as they would expect them to be. You know, like somebody who's pushing this kind of Naziist Aryan aesthetic, you'd expect them to be kind of quite, a mainstream blonde white, but they're all kind of like dark looking, and they're kind of often quite short people. So there's this very strong sub-white element in in this neo-Naziist tendency in the alt-right. Andrew Anglin, again, he's another midget. He has a unusual appearance for white people. He looks a little bit kind of off-white, as it were, you know. So what I think is happening is the sub-white group, they aspire to be in whiter because they don't feel white enough, and therefore this kind of Nazi-esque aesthetic is very appealing to them. And then with the sub-masculine group, they're attracted to the alt-right because they're attracted to this kind of Nazi aesthetic because of its very pronounced masculinity. So
Yes. Yeah, there is an obsession with the masculine ethos of Greece and
exactly,
Germany, medieval Germany.
yes, and this is also the reason why Nazism was quite attractive to gay people in its original iteration. I mean, there are a lot of well-known gay people in the Nazi movement, and there are all sorts of, not just gay people. The term I prefer to use is sub-masculine, and I would say that somebody like Nick Fuentes, who's not a Nazi type at all, really, I would say he's also a sub-masculine because this whole cat boy thing is
Exactly. That was so silly that up to now I cannot fathom why he did it.
yeah. And of course, Richard Spencer, he's also a sub-masculine, even though he did get married, and he reportedly fathered 2 children. Although he did actually accuse somebody else of fathering those children at one point of his divorce proceedings. So there is a very, very pronounced sub-masculine element to a lot of these people, and on the other hand, there's also a very, very sub-white element to these people. And these are the people who seem to be emotionally driven towards this iteration of the alt-right as a neo-Nazi movement.
Yes. But Colin, what are they hoping to restore? Obviously, Nazis are alluring, they like Hitler, but what is the total plan? Because obviously they want to restore society to a different state, a more pristine environment, and I don't believe that many of the critics of the alt-right are taking the movement seriously, because the alt-right is not a Christian movement, it's more pagan. And the alt-right, though anti-egalitarian and anti-democratic, is not a reflection of the old right represented by people like Albert J. Nock. So if you're going to write a book about the alt-right, you should know what the alt-right is not. And I don't like when writers conflate the alt-right with evangelical conservatism or the old right represented by Nock and Eric von Ledin and those writers. But I'm still yet to understand, what are they hoping to restore or to rebuild?
Well, I think my point is that they're not fully in control of themselves. The movement has been sabotaged by bad actors, by deep state elements, but also these people who are emotionally attracted to the alt-right, they're just LARPing. They're just it's a form of self-expression, really.
They're romantics then, they're romantics.
It's not a political movement. Because of that, it's not a political movement.
It's an aesthetic movement.
Yeah, it's an emotional, it's like a therapy movement or whatever. It's like they're dealing with who they are as people or whatever, which is not a political movement. It's not even a meta-political movement. And so it's become degraded. And so a lot of the ideas associated with the alt-right have a lot of validity, and they need to be explored and in some cases even implemented. But those ideas have become tarnished by their association with this psychological therapy movement that the alt-right later became, with these broken people trying to complete themselves through Nazi memes.
All right then. But Colin, have you read any of the books criticizing the alt-right?
I think I've read one or two, or bits of them anyway. I've definitely had a look. Nothing's really struck me, I think, you see, the thing is, I've got my own critique of the alt-right,
Yes,
and
so you don't need those silly books.
it's an insider view of the alt-right, and it's not based upon intellectualism, because the alt, what we're seeing is with a lot of things that people try to address intellectually, they're actually driven by other factors. I've already pointed to subversion. I've already pointed to the emotional psychological drive that certain ideas exert on people. So people are not rational beings. They can occasionally aspire to being rational beings, but for the most part, people are very emotionally driven, very blindly driven by certain inclinations, let's say.
All right. So, for example, Colin, I wouldn't say that I was attracted to the alt-right, but before it became very popular, people would often invoke the term old right. So I said, oh my God, I like Albert J. Nock, I like H.L. Mencken, I like Frank Chodorov, I like Louis Bardin. This is a really intellectual movement. But then I started to do research and read the real thinkers on the alt-right, and I recognized that it did not have much to offer. So for example, the traditional old right is pro-market, pro-globalization, but anti-globalism. If you're a real libertarian, you prefer a decentralized natural order. You're not a fan of the World Bank or the IMF. This right is similar to the interwar right. It's anti-globalization and anti-globalism, and to an extent very skeptical of free markets. So after a while, I became quite disappointed because I was expecting some mini Anthony Ludovici. Anthony Ludovici is a very famous, or was very famous, he's not remembered today. But the alt-right has disappointed me. I was expecting far more than memes and men posting Greek statues. Hello?
Yes. Well, I think, I mean, if you look through alt-right content going all the way back, there is plenty of intellectual content. There are lots of there's a lot of philosophy. There's a lot of literature. Even countercurrents today, they try to refract everything through very erudite intellectualism, and so you can always find kind of quite well written pieces that refer to various philosophers and writers and so on, important, it's intellectually significant people. But that's not really the main point. The main point is the core of ideas, and like, why do people believe in certain ideas? And with the American right is not an intellectual process. It's more like a kind of branding process for certain kind of geopolitical and economic developments. Like, the old American right was very small government, but they had to give that up due to the kind of expediencies of the Cold War, and so the right moved much more towards a kind of a big state right in America, because they had to match the Soviet Union. And so a lot of these processes they're not purely intellectual processes. Ideas rise and fall based upon kind of power realities and economic realities. And for example, why is Western civilization so kind of I guess the term would be ethnomasochist, or
Pathological altruism.
Yes, pathological altruism. It's the term self-loathing comes up a lot, white guilt, all of these ideas. Why are these ideas appearing in Western civilization? The reason for that is because they're forced to appear by the underlying socioeconomic reality. And the main socioeconomic reality that the West has is a fertility rate of about 1.5 or less. And if you have a society with a fertility rate of 1.5 or less, that's going to have all sorts of ideological and intellectual repercussions. And this is exactly what we see with the West. As the West has lost its ability to reproduce its core population, we see a rise in certain ideas, and those ideas are all tied to a certain nexus of realities, and that nexus of realities includes mass immigration. If you have a society that has 1.5 fertility rate, the population is diminishing generation on generation by, I think, 25%. And if a major Western economy underwent that amount of depopulation, it would have all sorts of economic knock-on effects. For example, you'd have to pay workers a lot more because labor would be incredibly scarce. You'd have to really cut rents because there'd be less people wanting to rent properties. And of course, the rich people who dominate society would be the ones who would suffer the most from that drastic depopulation, even though it might be quite beneficial to some of the people lower down the social scale. And so this is the fundamental reality that twists and shapes our culture, and which creates this very, very self-loathing negative view of the West. So those underlying realities are much more potent. They have much more gravity than ideas. Ideas later become the kind of window dressing for the deep reality. And that's also true in a much more micro scale with the kind of, the Trumpian alt-right and the post-2015 alt-right.
Yes, but I'm glad you mentioned Trump, because Trump started started off as a decisive president. He attacked the TPP. He wasn't in favor of the Paris Treaty. He mixed deregulation with populism. But by 2019, Trump was like a liberal Republican. Trump was pandering to blacks, the LGBT community, Hispanics. He was no longer talking about immigrations. Unfortunately, many saw Trump as a creation of the alt-right, but he disappointed us again. Can you, well, obviously it is because of politics, but do you have any special insight as to why Donald Trump changed so dramatically?
Well, it's because he was an outsider. An outsider doesn't actually know how things work. And then once he managed to pull off this incredible coup and become president, then he was subjected to all these insider forces. And, America, Trump was a rebellion against what America was becoming, but America was becoming what it was becoming because of these dominant socioeconomic realities that were exerting pressure in this way. And so Trump then was then pulled into line, and I think Trump is very much a disappointment, and the whole kind of America First movement has become a kind of hollowed out shell from what I can see. And so there's, originally there was a strong element of identitarianism. It was a much more open-ended form of identitarianism than the alt-right favored, obviously, or which certain nationalist movements favor. But it was clearly a form of identitarianism, and it was an attempt to set America apart a little bit from this kind of global reality. And so, that there's a certain element of maybe naivety in Trump, because the kind of things that he was instinctively trying to pull off require a lot more hard work and preparation, and they're politically they're very tough choices to make as well. They have a high political cost, in other words.
Yes, Trump became the president of Twitter. There's a big
Yeah.
difference between gaining popularity on Twitter and working hard. Trump should have expanded his base. I don't have a problem with Trump appealing to non-whites or non-conservatives, but you must maintain the original nature of the message. Don't water it down. In logic is needed. They need to temper your passion with logic. But after a few years, Trump was the president of Twitter. He was constantly arguing with the media and he became a joke. And the movement lost. Trump could have created the conditions that would lead to an actual intellectual or charismatic figure who represented the dissident right, and he failed.
Well, Trump had to fail in a way because the American political system doesn't allow outsiders to succeed. Even one like Trump, a real insurgent at the time, because America has this very, very anti-democratic two-party system, and I mean, what you're talking about with regard to Trump is that Trump had a genuine path he could have followed. That genuine path would have led him away from the GOP. But anybody who veers away from one of the two main political parties in America goes off into the wilderness. And so, people talk about Trump possibly creating his own party. That sounds good in theory, but once you create a third party in a two-party system, it's very, very risky, and you're more likely to just end up, going nowhere with that. And so that's why Trump couldn't create his own party, and because he couldn't create his own party, he had to veer towards the GOP, and he had to bring on all these inherently unreliable elements. And Trump has been kind of hijacked now by those elements. I mean, Trump seems to be hegemonic amongst Republicans. Republican voters love Trump, but the people around him, the people that he's actually promoting, are not genuine identitarians. They're not genuine, America firsters. They're all kind of these fake GOP types who just give lip service to, America first quotation marks, and who seek Trump's blessing. And Trump's become Jeb Bush, more or less, and he's quite happy, it seems, being Jeb Bush. He just wants to be the big guy who's the center of attention. That is what Trump has always been about. There's a lack of an ideological core to Trump.
Donald Trump could very well be an example of the submasculine type.
How do you mean?
No, because masculine men don't require validation from outsiders. Many of them need power and they build a base to improve status and gain power, but they don't rely on attention like Trump.
Yeah, that is, yeah. Trump needs to constantly signal how masculine he is. Therefore, he's not really masculine. And, these sub-masculine alt-righters who are attracted to this kind of hard-edged Nazi image, that they're doing the same thing, but in a different form. Yeah.
Yes.
So
but
it's Trump gay? Is he time to come out of the closet?
No, I doubt it. But before we continue, I must go back a bit to talk about the alt-right and why so many in the movement reject cultural nationalism. You read my piece, The Case for Cultural Whiteness, right?
Yeah, I did, and I read another piece in Countercurrents, which was quite critical of that.
Yes, written by Spencer Quinn. And I read Spencer's piece. I've read several of his articles, and again, I was baffled because Spencer is not really disagreeing with me, but I found it strange that he could not accept the view that some people are willing to assimilate into Western culture. So again, why is the alt-right unfriendly to people who are not white or
Well,
not fully conservative, but were interested or inclined to being a part of the West?
well, yeah, this is the problem of racial purism, and that causes all sorts of problematic areas to arise. Nobody would really believe. I mean, it's very very difficult to believe in. I mean, even the Nazis. Let's be honest. Even the Nazis didn't believe in racial purism. They had certain ideas about the Michelins. These were people that were partly Jewish. I think the guy who was basically in charge of the Luftwaffe, because
Mm.
Goering was officially in charge of the Luftwaffe, but he had better things to do than run the Luftwaffe on a day-to-day basis. But the guy that was basically in day-to-day charge of the Luftwaffe, I believe he was half Jewish. But they kind of like glossed over that, and so even the Nazis were not racial purists, and so the idea that you can be very racially pure as a large society or as a civilization is a little bit veering towards irrationality, let's say. So, what people really want, I feel, is kind of racial continuity, not racial purity. Um, they want their group to have its own society and to be the majority or to be dominant in that society.
And that
And what
makes
we
sense.
Yeah, and everybody can understand this idea. This is a common sense idea. It's not like some crazy alt-right neo-Nazi meme. This is what people all around the world understand. This is what people throughout history understand. They like their group continuity, and but the problem with kind of cultural Westernism is not this element of occasionally a foreign element or foreigners coming into a society. It's all related to the kind of racial replacement that people perceive. And the reason they perceive that is because we live in mass immigration societies. And, that kind of destabilizes everything, because you might say, like, okay, there's a certain minority of people who are living in the West, and they can maybe aspire to becoming Western in their culture. They can take on Western modes of behavior. They can, act white, as it were, whatever, you know. But that is undercut by mass immigration, because mass immigration means you see generation on generation a massive replacement of the core population. And so this is the problem, why people are suspicious of this idea of cultural westernization. Because if you can westernize people, it makes mass immigration and racial replacement less problematic. But still, that's what's happening. So people, it sort of kicks off a fear and defense mechanism in a lot of people, and this is what we're seeing in nationalist movements and in parts of the distant right.
I agree with you, Colin. So genes are real, but culture is also extremely important. Political scientists have argued that it can take years to change culture, and Western culture is unique. Westerners are individualistic, less tolerant, less ethnocentric, less likely to conform, and achievement oriented. Lawrence Mead has an excellent book titled The Burden of Freedom, and he's arguing that America is experiencing a cultural problem because many of the immigrants are not from Europe. So during the early years, the anarchists were problematic. People from Italy, Irish, and the Eastern Europeans also created challenges in American society, but over time they were able to assimilate. Non-whites are from a completely different culture. So obviously it's harder for non-whites to assimilate into American culture. And today they're not being encouraged to become Americans by the mainstream left and some on the right. So I do object to immigration in a sense, even though I'm a libertarian. Immigration is linked to economic growth and innovation, but it can depress the wages of ordinary workers, and we have data to support this. So I'm not against restricting immigration. It makes sense. I just oppose people who reject assimilation and cultural nationalism. But restricting immigration is not a silly policy. Immigrants need America. The brightest people migrate. Studies have shown that people who migrate are better off than those who did not. They're also smarter. And when people migrate to the US or other developed countries, they become richer. So poor people who migrate need America, but America doesn't really need immigrants. The economy is large. The American economy can facilitate internal trade. We can do without immigrants. That's
Uh,
that. That's my take.
well, I wonder, that would depend upon very basic things like, as I alluded to, or as I mentioned before, the fertility rate. What is the fertility rate of America? It's probably higher than Europe, but it's still lower than replacement level. So America is in a position. I mean, also the American economy has been founded on a year-on-year rapid population growth. If you look at the American economy through time, it's always had a very quickly growing population, and that has been one of the driving factors in American economic growth. And just to actually just maintain population at on a flat line, they would have to really change their culture and society.
Exactly. Why people
They,
are not having children? That's the issue.
Yeah, I mean the main problem is in a way is not race. The main problem is feminism, and
Exactly. Feminism. Feminism is a disease, and I'm not being polemical. Men and women are different. Women are nurturers. They take care of children, and the traits expressed by women allow them to be good friends, wives, and mothers. The masculine ethic drives civilization, and this is a fact. But continue.
yes, but the reason feminism has been created is because it suits certain businesses.
Business people,
Yes,
they can lower the cost of labor.
yeah, they lower the cost of labor. They give women more money. Women are very great at consumerism. They spend money. You give a
Yes,
woman money, you won't see it again. So men don't need so many things. They have simpler tastes and needs, and so they tend to hang on to money more. Women earning money, high paying jobs, whatever, they'll spend all that money. It has a
and
big
depend on their husbands.
yeah.
And this
So
is a
we've got
fact again, a data-driven fact. But continue.
yeah. Yeah. So we've created these ideas, these dominant social trends because of a short-term economic benefit, and this is the essential problem with the West. It's not this ideology is different from that ideology or whatever. It's basically there's a kind of blindness to our society. We're being sort of pushed along by these, in a sense, transhumanist processes that we're not really aware of, and we're this is the essential problem. We have to achieve some kind of true consciousness about this.
I agree. And so for example, some time ago, I was reading an article, and the writer said that managers don't have a problem with trans pronouns because by using trans pronouns, we don't have to wonder about the gender of the person getting the email. So the transgender phenomenon is actually cheaper for businesses. So, for example, instead of saying dear sir, madam, you can just say they, and
Yeah.
that's less time consuming. So you're right, it's
Yes.
driven by money.
And you can have one toilet and more floor space. Although everybody's now buying everything online anyway, so
Yeah. And do you know what's also, well, it is not funny, but I laugh because Colin, I am no longer in the business of being polite. When people are dumb, we need to tell them abortion benefits men. Studies show that women who are depressed are more likely to have abortions. Stable women are not going to have abortions because they're getting support from their male partner. Women who have abortion are elevating men. If I like to sleep around and a woman gets pregnant and she opts to have an abortion, I'm happy. Abortion is actually benefiting men, it's not benefiting women.
Yeah, yeah, especially if the men are forced to pay for the child they didn't want. Yes, so you could say that. Also, you could say that there could be a healthy form of feminism, a feminism that actually emphasized the things that you just mentioned, that women are happier having children, they're happier
Yes.
being part of a family, and a kind of single career woman coming home at night to her cat is not exactly
No, no, they're
optimum.
they're unhappy. Satoshi Kanawaza, he wrote an article citing a study that evaluated the paradox of female unhappiness. Women are educated, they're told that they can rule the world, but they're still unhappy.
Hmm.
Women have a greater preference to form families. Men
Yes, but
naturally are loners, but you can
yeah,
continue.
but this is another problem, you see, because who dominates the feminist movement? It's not the kind of happily married woman that. If you're a happily married woman with kids, you're not even in the feminist movement. So the feminist movement is made up of these kind of toxic people, and this is the case with lots of movements. It's kind of healthy, busy people with a good job and a good family life are not going to get involved in politics, meta politics, online activism, uh, intellectualism, even. So um, these activities are all highly selective for a certain kind of person, and
Misfits.
exactly. So our whole culture has been driven by misfits, because if you think about the people on who are doing Twitter, the people who are like dominating Twitter, they're dominating Twitter because they're like tweeting about 300 times a day.
Th- th- th-
Uh,
They're
normal healthy
losers.
people, yeah, normal healthy people with families and jobs are not on Twitter all day tweeting. And so our whole culture has been driven by this very, very dysfunctional element who have a lot of issues, a lot of psychological baggage. And the feminist movement is a form of that as well.
And Colin, the personal is not the political. Do not elevate mundane issues beyond their level of importance. And this is what the feminist movement has done. So, for example, if you criticize a woman, you are sexist. If you argue that men and women have different traits, you are evil. So, feminism has infiltrated society, and as a result, we have lost the ability to engage each other like adults.
Yeah, yeah. This is wokeism, because, like, all of these things, feminism, anti-racism, inverted commas, all of these things come from wokeism, and wokeism is an attempt to basically kind of coordinate the culture around certain very dysgenic, poisonous, toxic ideas.
Yes, and Colin, there's also the issue of accountability. If there is an agreement, I am accountable to uphold my end of the agreement. As someone who was raised properly, I am naturally polite even when I don't like other people. However, you don't have to be nice to strangers, and I dislike the moralizing language of Twitter. We must hold people accountable. Accountable for what? For not being nice?
Or for having an opinion. Yeah, this is the trouble. Our culture is self-evidently going off the rails because people are not allowed to say what they think. I mean, this is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. The people were not able to express what they, legitimate criticisms of whatever. Um, and what happens is that people become very, very cynical and twisted, and nobody believes anything. And finally, the whole thing just collapses because there's just so much, there's a limited amount of bullshit that any society can carry. And hopefully, we're near to breaking point, but
We're
sometimes
not near to breaking point. We
I
can
said
only.
hopefully.
Okay.
Fingers crossed, but yeah, I know. Maybe they can pile on a lot more bullshit. That is entirely feasible.
And Colin, are you a religious person?
I would have to say I'm not particularly religious. I don't really believe in the Christian God or any other gods. I have a kind of maybe an emotional sympathy with elements of paganism, but there again, it's not something I would say I have a burning faith in.
Okay, because one of my objections to the not dissident right, but to the woke, not, let me not say woke left, but to the sensible left, is that many of its adherents fail to acknowledge that we're having a theological crisis. If you lose religion, the family, and the nation state, people will discover alternatives. So if the
Yeah,
family
yeah.
is not important, then Twitter can become your family. Feminists are your family. The local
Mhm.
LGBT club up the road is your family. And this is the
Yeah, this is
problem.
this
We
is a
have
well
destroyed the little platoons, but continue.
yeah this is a kind of well-known idea that people who lose their religion have to find another religion. And this is very observable in Europe, because like in the 19th century, has Christianity declined, movements like nationalism started to rise up, and so the nation became a kind of religion for a lot of people. And then in the 20th century, there's other ideologies that filled that kind of, people sometimes describe it as a vacuum. And so people seem to have a psychological need to believe in something. And of course, people who are religious would see that as evidence that God exists, because why would we have this vacuum to believe in something, this
Well,
need to believe in something, unless there was a God who put it there?
well, that's not really evidence that God exists. I do believe in God, but we can argue that evolution created morality. This is not the purpose for our conversation, though, but that argument that the the absence of God can lead to people becoming depressed means that God exists. It's not a strong argument, but I do get your point. I agree that if there is no God, we will discover alternative religions, but I don't think that's a very convincing argument. But then again, I'm a different type of Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to get away from that though, because if you don't believe, I mean, if you can't, I think most people today can't believe in God. I'm talking about in developed Western societies. There's just so much history behind that. There's uh, Christianity in the West. The main religion was Christianity. So Christianity really stuck its neck out by saying how the world worked. And then for the last 500 years, science has been disproving almost everything that the Bible said about the universe. And so people have really, intelligent people have kind of lost faith in religion. And some people try to be religious for all sorts of kind of complicated personal psychological reasons. And some people can even, I think, convince themselves about Christianity, that it's the Christian order of the universe, and so on. But I think I think it's not necessarily the case that people who stop believing in religion veer off and believe in some other crazy thing. That sometimes definitely happens, but I don't believe it happens in every case. I think it's possible to be non-religious without putting a lot of religious energy into some sort of other weird belief. So, I think you have to really believe in what you believe in, and you've got to examine your ideas, and you've got to use, data and logic, and you've got to detach what you believe from your emotions. And if you do that, and those are all kind of things that people have done in the past. If you do that, you can push towards understanding the world in a much more objective way, and you can develop a set of ideas that can deal with reality without distorting reality.
All right, Colin, I like the nature of this conversation. It's interesting because originally the plan was to talk about the alt-right and politics, and now we're talking about religion, and religion is always a fascinating topic. But I'm going to continue with religion before getting back to the main story. Colin, this is my perspective, and I think sensible people should agree. The Bible is a philosophical and ethical tome, providing guidelines as to how one should live. All biblical stories can be fake, but yet God is real. I Christians are taking the Bible literally. If you look at it as philosophy, God is real. He created men. Men were inspired by God to write a book. That's how I perceive the Bible. So the stories do not have to be real to justify my belief in God. They're open to interpretation. So, for example, I have a theory called biblical realism. Because of the fall, evil exists, and as a result, we read about genocides and rapes and mass murders in the Bible. Biblical realism. We're no longer perfect. Man fell from grace, and as such, progress is not always inevitable. If Christians adopt a more logical approach to reading the Bible, then they won't flee religion or fall into depression when some of their assertions are proven to be untrue by science. What is your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you seem to be alluding to is a form of kind of cultural continuity. Like I was talking earlier about, demographic continuity. That's important to give people a sense of, a kind of healthy sense of identity and a kind of sense of security in the universe. And also, I think cultural continuity, a case could be made for cultural continuity, whereas we don't attack and reject our past. This is what's happening more and more in our kind of highly toxic state. Everything in the past is being recast through the lens of wokeism. Therefore, everybody in the past is suddenly becoming so evil according to this woke agenda. And
Not Genghis Khan though. Some Europeans are painting Genghis Khan in a positive light.
oh yeah, the Mongolocaust.
Yes,
The
he,
Mongolocaust was very good for the environment, apparently. So
he was pro-religion and pro-women and facilitated globalization. People love Genghis Khan.
oh, Greta approves 100%.
Greta Thunberg.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we have to have a healthy. I mean, a healthy society should embrace its past, and our ideological or cultural past includes Christianity. And if we could recast Christianity in a way that is more, that fits in with our modernist scientific outlook on life, that would probably be beneficial. But if we see the past as something evil, like the left does, then that's going to be ultimately very, very toxic and self-destructive.
I agree.
I mean, it's very interesting, like looking at how the Russians construct their view of the past. Because they have somebody like Putin, president of Russia, who used to be a member of the KGB, used to be an insider in the communist system. He's sort of pro Stalin, and he's also kind of pro Tsar. And so he thinks a strong Russia has to have a strong belief in its history. It has to believe in its historical journey. So Putin could say, like, okay, the Tsar was the good guy, the communists were the bad guy. That would create a very disjointed history. It would put Russia in a position of being a kind of victimized country for 70 or 80 years. And whether that's true or not, that's not the message that Putin wants. He wants to see Russia as a kind of product of a strong historical process, a strong, healthy historical process that had different stages. So Tsarism is part of that. Respect for Tsarism is part of that.
The
But
Orthodox
also,
Church, Very
Yes,
important.
of course, and but also, the communist revolution, Stalinism, the modernization of Russia, the Great Patriotic War against the invading Nazis. All that is also very much part of the mythos of modern day Russia. So I think that's maybe in some cases that's very disingenuous, and it's very it has certain kind of inbuilt contradictions, let's say, but also I think overall that attempt is a healthy attempt. You have to have a positive view of where you come from as a culture and as a society. So even though we are more or less in a post-Christian age, we have to also view Christianity as part of the journey, part of the story of our society, and we have to conceptualize that in a much more positive way as a society that's actually going to go somewhere instead of just dissipate itself in toxic globalism.
But Colin, could we attribute the culture of Russia to its peculiar form of Christianity? In the West, Christianity is more rational and open to debate. Byzantine Christianity was very mystical. It was a literal form of Christianity. In the Byzantine Empire, the Christian writers were very, very brilliant, but they were less likely to challenge orthodoxy in contrast to the West. So maybe this is one of the reasons why Russian culture is so different from the political West, because of the influence of Christianity from the East.
Oh yeah. I think Byzantine Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, it has much less of a division between the secular and the
Yes.
religious. I mean, Europe was defined in a sense by the kind of polarization between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire and so on. Yeah, so I think that's a kind of historical, cultural debate, really. Like these um, earlier forms. Again, this is another way in which our society is blind, because we're sort of echoing things from the past, which most people are not even aware of. And in a way, that's a good thing and a bad thing, because looking at it in a positive way, that gives us some kind of connection, a healthy connection to our past. But looking at it in a negative way, it means that we are not fully conscious of why we're doing things, why we're creating certain structures, why we're behaving in certain political ways. There's certain unseen blind historical forces controlling us, and that can sometimes be a good thing if it pushes us in the right direction, but it might accidentally push us in a very negative direction sometimes.
All right. So, Colin, do you think that our present culture is fixated on the wrong writers? So, for example, I don't hear people talking about my one of my heroes, Ludovici or Christopher Dawson or Knock or any of those traditional writers who were well read and could write essays and books detailing the rise of the West and other societies. Why? Why aren't we focusing on better writers? Hello, Colin?
Yeah, people don't read books anymore, do they? They just listen to interesting, fascinating podcasts like this.
But Colin, some YouTubers are interesting, but many of them are not. That's why I started this program.
Yeah. Again, there's certain types of people who succeed at podcasting, and usually this is something Luke Ford says a lot. The podcasters who tell people what they want to hear tend to do very well, but podcasters who kind of challenge their audience and try to
Yes.
make them think about things are not necessarily that popular, and they tend to have much more of a niche audience, which probably is what will happen in this particular case.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if this podcast may become popular. That's not really my aim. I just like to be stimulated, and you're a bright guy. But I doubt that a podcast like this will become super popular. I interviewed Gottfried and Greg Johnson, and what's interesting is that during my interview with Greg Johnson, I didn't challenge him on stupid questions. We talked about metapolitics, the pagan roots of the alt-right, and people are not interested in analyzing society at a deep level.
Yes, don't get me started talking about Greg Johnson.
Yeah, I know. But I like Greg. I think he's very smart and articulate. I do like Greg, but he wrote a piece that was very unkind to countercurrents.
Yeah, did I? Wow,
Yeah,
that's a
the
surprise.
Nazi gay cult.
Yeah, yes, I just can't get this vibe from them. Really, just I can't get away from. I know them too well. That's the trouble.
Yes, yes. You said that all their writers are almost all of them are gay. That's
Yes,
what
but
you said.
I did actually write for Countercurrents, but that was the kind of when Countercurrents was going through its straight phase.
Okay then, but yeah, there is an article you didn't write it. It was published by Utter Contempt, but a paragraph is very interesting, and I'm going to read an excerpt. It's about Zionism and the Israeli foreign lobby. Let me read. Thus, if US military planning has anything to do with Israel's security, it's because Israel is a strategic asset. They're a politically stable, hugely innovative, and military formidable ally of the Gulf monarchies that produce all of America's oil. And they're a huge market for American weapons, among other goods and services. America's interest in containing Iran is also heavily tied to control of global oil markets. So, it was in America's interest to strike a deal with Iran in 2010 and leave the Israelis to sweat an Iranian nuclear breakout, which we're still sweating. At the time, Obama's national security advisor even threatened to shoot down Israeli fighter jets if they tried to use Iraqi airspace to attack Iran. And the point is quite simple. Americans support Israel because of what they can get. It's not really about Jewish power structures to that great extent.
Uh, yeah. I think that Utter Contempt. He's an excellent writer, and I often republish his articles at Affirmative Right. But yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. There is a genuine movement amongst American Jews that they have to support and defend Israel for very emotional reasons. But also, America does get, well, not America. It's wrong to say America, but certain elements in the American power
Defense
structure.
groups.
Yeah. Certain elements in the American power structure, uh, they benefit from the whole kind of Israeli situation. And this is a kind of weird symbiology between all of these groups. I mean, right now, the Israelis are bombing certain buildings in Gaza after warning people to exit the buildings and so on. And to me, I think what's really going on is that the Palestinians have developed a weird form of welfare culture, because the people in the West Bank, people in Gaza, they're basically living off foreign aid. And there's vast amounts of foreign aid that get poured into these places, and they get poured into those places because the people in Gaza and the people in the West Bank successfully market themselves as victims. And so when you have these occasional flare-ups, and you have these occasional awkward interactions with the Israeli security forces, this can all be repackaged to sell the idea of the Palestinians as these poor little victims. I mean, the thing that kind of drives this home for me is, in a place like Gaza, you have 2 million people, you have lots of young men. All those young men, if they really wanted to, they could go off to other parts of the Arab world and get jobs in places like Dubai, in the Emirates, in Kuwait, in these oil-rich states. Those oil-rich states are always looking for labor because the people there are too rich to do the work themselves. So instead of employing Palestinians, they employ people from Bangladesh and India and so on. And so the people in Gaza, to me, they seem quite happy to live there because they are having these subsidized lifestyles where they don't really have to work too hard. And but that kind of cozy lifestyle depends upon them being seen as victims. So I think this is part of what's going on. But when you look at it from the American point of view, America has, post World War II, America evolved into this giant statist apparatus out of necessity. It had to do this because it had to defend the world against the threat of communism, which was also very much a threat against the American heartland. After the Cold War, America didn't really have that excuse. America could have moved in a different direction. They could have said, okay, communism has collapsed. The Soviet Union is no more. China is not a threat yet. So we can now get rid of our enormous military industrial complex. We can shrink our government back down to the level it was at in the 1920s, etc. They could have decided to move in that direction. But of course they didn't. And the reason they didn't was because of these entrenched interests. Those entrenched interests then went around trying to find another excuse to engage in this globalist empire. And in order to do that, Israel became more and more important. Israel is America's excuse to project power overseas, as it were.
Brilliant assessment. I love it. So, Colin, we have been speaking for over 1 hour, so obviously we're going to wrap up. But before we do so, do you have more comments?
And usually, when people ask me that at the end of podcasts, I say not really. Just please listen carefully to everything that we've said already.
All right. Okay, but I have a question. What do you think about Jack Donovan?
Yeah, I think Jack is a refugee from the alt-right.
Yes.
Ooh. And I hope he finds a safe sanctuary in the kind of LARPy pagan movement.
No, I'm laughing because I read a piece on one of these alt-right sites, and the writer referenced to male bonding, but the the writer reference to male bonding, males bonding.
Yes.
Yes, the homo.
Mannabund.
Yes, it's the German word, but he didn't use that term though. But male bonding and the homoerotics of the alt-right. It's a bit troubling if you're a conservative.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I think we've already touched upon that.
We touched that
in some depth, in fact.
Yeah, but we just didn't mention Jack Donovan. But and then before you
go, well, Jack to his credit, Jack Donovan, he was always above board about his sexuality. So there's a lot of people who aren't. That's something else we could talk about, but we probably don't want to.
No. And do you have what do you think about Bronze Age pervert? I think he's interesting. He's a compelling character.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't made up my mind yet on BAP.
Okay, why?
I don't know what to make of him. It's just he's a bit like a comedy character, and he's obviously into this whole kind of bodybuilding gay thing. Whatever. I
No,
just don't know what to make of that.
yeah,
But
okay, Colin, I'm just laughing because I don't have a problem with two men being friends, but up it's up to a point.
mhm,
I'm not into this men forming a cult and hugging each other. I can't be bothered.
mhm.
I really can't be bothered.
Well, we could do a podcast sometime on
Yes,
masculinity sometime, but
yes.
it opens up a lot of areas really, and they need very very kind of sort of nuanced and gentle treatment.
Yes, but one thing I can tell you, they're very smart. There's a link between male homosexuality and intelligence, and it's greater for men than for women.
Hmm.
I think these are quite smart characters. But
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, what utility do their uh, ideas and cultural and political manifestations have for the rest of us? That remains to be seen.
you're right. But I enjoyed the podcast. Did you?
Yeah, yeah, it was interesting chat. I think we covered a lot
A
of
lot of
ground in a
stuff.
in a, in a,
Exactly.
in a short space of time.
Exactly. I think this is the number one podcast for the dissident right.
Yeah, it wouldn't be too hard, but I think there are some other good podcasts. I'd also recommend Luke Ford. He's a compulsive figure who podcasts almost every day, several times a day, but he does manage to have a lot of good content as well.
All right. But thanks for coming, and at some point we'll talk again. All right.
Okay, cheers.